What happens when a man who has spent his life chasing power and profit decides to walk in the shoes of someone he's never truly seen? What happens when he trades boardrooms for highways, tailored suits for worn denim, and discovers that a single conversation can unravel everything he thought he knew? This is the story of James Whitaker, a CEO who believed he had conquered the world until he realized he had missed its heartbeat. It was a crisp October morning in Chicago, the kind where the city's skyline gleamed like polished steel against a pale blue sky. On the 47th floor of a glass tower, James Whitaker stood at the window of his corner office, his reflection sharp in the polished panes. At 45, he was the picture of success, tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair, and piercing gray eyes that missed nothing. His navy suit, custom-made in London, hugged his frame with precision, and the gold cufflinks at his wrists caught the sunlight. Behind him, a mahogany desk held a single framed photo, an old snapshot of him and his father, standing in front of a battered pickup truck. Back when Whitaker Logistics was just a dream, James was no longer that scrappy kid from the South Side. He was the CEO of Whitaker Logistics, a nationwide empire that moved goods from coast to coast, its fleet of trucks a lifeline for businesses across America. What had started as a small operation with 3 rigs had grown into a billion-dollar company under his relentless drive. Long hours, tough calls, and a knack for outmaneuvering competitors had made James a legend in the industry. But today, as he stared out at the city, a restlessness gnawed at him, like a loose thread in an otherwise perfect suit. On his desk, a quarterly report lay open, its numbers glowing with profit margins and growth projections. Yet James barely glanced at it. His mind was elsewhere, tangled in a letter he'd received the day before. It was handwritten, slipped into an unmarked envelope, and left on his desk by someone who clearly didn't want to be traced. The words were simple but sharp. "You sit in your tower while we drive through the night. We're not machines, Mr. Whitaker. We're people. When will you see us?" The letter had struck a nerve. James had built his empire on discipline and results, but he'd never thought much about the men and women behind the wheel, the truck drivers who kept his company running. They were names on payroll sheets, statistics and reports. He knew their routes, their delivery times, their efficiency ratings. But their lives? Their struggles? Those were blanks he'd never bothered to fill in. The letter felt like an accusation, and for a man who prided himself on control, it was unsettling to realize how little he knew. He turned from the window and paced the office, his polished shoes silent on the thick carpet. The walls were lined with awards plaques for innovation, framed articles from Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. But as he looked at them, he saw his father's face instead, weathered and kind, his voice echoing from years past. "A company isn't money, James. It's people. Never forget that." His father had driven trucks himself, back when the company was just a handful of rigs and a lot of hope. He'd known every driver by name, shared coffee with them at dawn, listened to their stories. James had been too busy building an empire to do the same. The restlessness grew into a decision, sudden and unshakable. What if he could see what his drivers saw? What if he could live their lives, even for a moment? The idea was absurd. EOS didn't trade boardrooms for truck cabs. But James wasn't one to back away from a challenge. He sat at his desk, picked up the phone, and called Emily, his executive assistant. "Clear my schedule for the next 2 weeks," he said, his voice steady but laced with something she couldn't quite place. "I'm taking a leave of absence." Emily hesitated. Leave? But the shareholder meeting is next week, and handle it," James cut in. "Tell everyone I'm unreachable. No exceptions." He hung up before Rosin K. The Godfather played softly in the background, but James barely noticed. His mind was racing. To pull this off, he'd need to become someone else entirely. No one could know he was James Whitaker. He'd go undercover as a truck driver, live their life, drive their routes, and see the world through their eyes. The thought sent a thrill through him, a mix of fear and excitement he hadn't felt in years. Asterisk, but it wouldn't be easy. James hadn't driven a truck since he was a teenager, helping his father on summer runs. He'd need to look the part, act the part, and blend in with men and women who'd spent years on the road. He reached out to a discreet contact, a former theater makeup artist named Carla, who could transform him. Over the next 2 days, she worked her magic, shaving his neatly trimmed beard, dyeing his hair a nondescript brown, and fitting him with contact lenses that dulled his sharp gray eyes to a soft hazel. She taught him to slouch a little, to soften his clipped, authoritative tone into something warmer, rougher around the edges. By the time she was done, James Whitaker was gone. In his place stood Jake Turner, a 40-something everyman with a faded baseball cap and a worn denim jacket. As Jake, he'd started a distribution hub in Ohio, posing as a new hire. He'd forged the necessary credentials, a commercial driver's license, a clean record through a trusted fixer who asked no questions. The plan was risky, even reckless. If anyone discovered his identity, the fallout would be catastrophic. Headlines, lawsuits, a hit to the company's stock. But the risk only fueled him. This was his chance to answer the question that haunted him. Who are the people who keep my world turning? Unbeknownst to James, a shadow loomed over his plan. Richard Hayes, the company's ambitious vice president of finance, had been in the office when Emily announced James's sudden leave. Richard was a numbers man, lean and sharp-eyed, with a knack for spotting inconsistencies. He'd long resented James's iron grip on the company, and the CEO's absence felt like an opportunity or a threat. Why would James vanish without explanation? Just as Richard was pushing for cost-cutting measures that would slash driver benefits, suspicion took root. Richard made a quiet call to a private investigator he kept on retainer. "Find out where James Whitaker is," he said, "and don't let him know you're looking." Back in his office, James packed a small duffel bag with essentials: jeans, flannel shirts, a cheap phone. He glanced at the photo of him and his father one last time. The memory of those early days' grease-stained hands, the hum of engines, his father's laughter felt like a call to action. He locked the office door behind him, stepped into the elevator, and descended into a world he thought he understood. But James Whitaker was about to learn that empires are built on more than ambition. They're built on sweat, sacrifice, and stories he'd never heard. And somewhere on the open road, a single voice, a woman named Sarah Coleman, would change his life forever. The Ohio sunrise was a thin smear of orange across a gray horizon, barely piercing the haze of diesel fumes that hung over the Whitaker Logistics distribution hub. James Whitaker, now Jake Turner, stood in the gravel lot, his breath visible in the chilly dawn air. Gone were the tailored suits and polished shoes of his Chicago office. In their place, he wore scuffed work boots, a faded denim jacket, and a baseball cap pulled low over his dyed brown hair. His hazel contact lenses itched, and his shoulders ached from a night spent on a motel cot. For the first time in years, he felt out of place, a stranger in a world he'd built but never truly known. The hub was a hive of activity. Trucks rumbled in and out, their engines growling like restless beasts, while drivers shouted over the din, exchanging clipboards and curses. Forklifts darted through the chaos, stacking pallets of shrink-wrapped goods. James clutched a crumpled work order in his hand. His new identity's first assignment: drive a load of electronics from Toledo to Louisville, a 300-mile haul due by midnight. The simplicity of the task on paper belied the reality he was about to face. He hadn't driven a semi-truck since he was 16, tagging along with his father on summer runs. Back then, it had felt like an adventure. Now, it loomed like a test he wasn't sure he could pass. His rig was an older model, its red paint chipped and streaked with grime. The cab smelled of stale coffee and motor oil, and the driver's seat sagged under his weight. James climbed, in his movements stiff and uncertain. The dashboard was a maze of gauges and switches, far more complex than he remembered. He fumbled with the keys, the engine sputtering to life with a shudder that rattled his bones. As he shifted into gear, the truck lurched forward, nearly stalling. A nearby driver, a burly man with a gray beard, shot him a look that was half amusement, half pity. James forced a grin, muttering, "New guy," under his breath. The man nodded and turned away, but the moment stung. James Whitaker didn't make mistakes, at least, not where anyone could see. The first hour on the road was a trial by fire. The highway stretched out like a gray ribbon, flanked by endless fields and the occasional billboard hawking fast food or Jesus. James gripped the wheel, his knuckles wide, as he wrestled with the truck's sluggish handling. The GPS unit on. The dash was broken, forcing him to rely on a dog-eared road atlas spread across the passenger seat. He misjudged a turn outside Columbus, nearly clipping a guardrail, and cursed himself silently. This was supposed to be simple. He'd overseen logistics for $1 billion company. How hard could driving a truck be? But the weight of the 80,000-pound rig, the constant vibration in his hands, and the ticking clock of his delivery deadline told a different story by noon. Exhaustion set in. The road blurred into a hypnotic loop of asphalt and white lines. His back ached from the stiff seat, and his legs cramped in the cramped cab. He stopped at a gas station to refuel, his hands trembling as he wrestled with the heavy fuel nozzle. Inside the convenience store, he grabbed a lukewarm coffee and a stale sandwich, the kind of meal he hadn't eaten in decades. As he paid, the cashier, a tired woman with deep lines around her eyes, barely looked at him. He was just another driver, invisible in his anonymity. The realization was both freeing and unsettling. For the first time, James understood what it meant to be unseen. Back on the road, the solitude hit harder. Hours passed with only the crackle of the CB radio for company. Other drivers' voices drifted through, swapping stories about traffic jams and cheap diners, their banter laced with a camaraderie James couldn't penetrate. He tried joining in once, his voice awkward and stilted, but the channel went silent. He switched it off, the hum of the engine filling the void. The loneliness was a physical thing, pressing against his chest. In his old life, he was surrounded by people, assistants, executives, investors. Here, he was alone, mile after mile, with nothing but his thoughts and the endless road. That evening, he pulled into a truck stop outside Dayton, its neon sign buzzing like a beacon in the dusk. The lot was packed with rigs, their chrome grills glinting under sodium lights. Inside the diner, the air was thick with the smell of fried onions and cigarette smoke. James slid into a booth, his body aching from 10 hours behind the wheel. A group of drivers sat at the counter, their laughter rough and easy. He caught snippets of their conversation. Complaints about late payments, a kid's soccer game missed, a marriage strained by weeks away. These were the voices of his company, the pulse of Whitaker Logistics. And he'd never heard them before. One driver, a stocky man in his 50s named Mike, noticed James and waved him over. "You the new guy from Toledo?" he asked, his voice gravelly but warm. James nodded, forcing a smile. "Jake Turner," he said, the name still foreign on his tongue. Mike introduced the others. Anna, a wiry woman with a quick laugh and a sleeve of tattoos, and Tom, a quiet young man who kept his eyes on his coffee. They welcomed James with a mix of curiosity and wariness, the way you size up a stranger who might not last. Over greasy burgers, they shared stories of the road near misses. With black ice, bosses who didn't care, the ache of missing home. Anna spoke of sending money to her mother in Pittsburgh, her voice tight with pride and worry. Mike griped about the company's new routing software, which shaved hours off their breaks to boost efficiency. "Whitaker's squeezing us dry," he said, spitting the name like a curse. James froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. He wanted to argue, to defend his decisions, but Jake Turner had no voice in this fight. He nodded instead, the guilt settling like a stone in his gut thought as the night wore on. James overheard a hushed conversation at another table. Two drivers, their faces shadowed under ball caps, were talking about a rumor. Whitaker Logistics was planning to cut health benefits to offset rising fuel costs. "Heard it from a guy in corporate," one said. "Hayes is pushing it hard." James's heart sank. Richard Hayes, his VP of Finance, had floated the idea months ago, and James had dismissed it as a last resort. Had Richard gone behind his back? The thought gnawed at him, a reminder that his absence might have consequences he hadn't foreseen. He excused himself from Mike's group, claiming he needed rest, and headed to his truck. The cab felt smaller now, the walls closing in with the weight of what he'd heard. Sleep was elusive. The sleeper berth was a narrow coffin of a space, the mattress thin and lumpy. Outside, the hum of idling engines and distant highway traffic seeped through the walls. James lay awake, replaying the day. The physical toll was one thing. His hands were blistered, his neck stiff, but the emotional weight was heavier. He'd expected hard work, but not this. The grind, the isolation, the quiet resentment simmering among his drivers. He thought of the letter that had spurred this journey. "We're not machines, Mr. Whitaker. We're people." For the first time, he felt the truth of those words. But could he endure 2 weeks of this? And what if someone recognized him? Tom had given him a strange look earlier, as if trying to place his face. If his cover was blown, the fallout would be catastrophic, not just for him, but for the company he'd spent his life building. Back in Chicago, Richard Hayes sat in his office, a glass of scotch in hand. The private investigator's report was thin but troubling. James had been spotted leaving his apartment with a duffel bag. No clear destination. Richard's instincts screamed that something was off. He'd worked too hard to let James's whims jeopardize his plans for the company. "Keep digging," he told the investigator over the phone. "I want to know where he is by the end of the week." James didn't know it yet, but the clock was ticking. As he drifted into a fitful sleep, the road stretched out before him, a path of asphalt and uncertainty. He'd come to see his driver's world, but he was only beginning to understand its cost. And somewhere ahead, in the quiet of a shared cab, a woman named Sarah Coleman would show him what it truly meant to keep going. The 5th day of James Whitaker's undercover journey dawned gray and heavy, the Ohio sky sagging with the threat of rain. As Jake Turner, he pulled his rig into the Whitaker Logistics Hub in Toledo, his body stiff from another night in the truck's cramped sleeper berth. The past 4 days had been a relentless grind, long hours, aching muscles, and the gnawing solitude of the open road. He'd begun to see the world his drivers lived in, a world of asphalt and deadlines. But it was a surface understanding, like skimming the first page of a book. Today, that book would open wide, and a woman named Sarah Coleman would turn its pages. James parked his truck in the bustling lot, the air thick with diesel and the clamor of engines. His work order for the day was different, a 2-driver run, a 400-mile haul from Toledo to Knoxville, Tennessee, carrying a load of medical supplies. He'd be paired with another driver, someone named Coleman, for the entire route. The idea of company was a relief after days of silence, but it also made him nervous. Alone, he could hide behind the wheel. With someone else in the cab, every word, every gesture would test his disguise. He adjusted his baseball cap, checked his reflection in the side mirror, hazel eyes, unshaven jaw, a stranger's face, and headed to the dispatch office. Inside, the air was stale, the walls plastered with safety posters and faded maps. A gruff dispatcher named Carl handed James his route details, barely looking up from his clipboard. "You're with Coleman today," he said, jerking his thumb toward a woman leaning against the counter. "Don't be late." James turned, and there she was, Sarah Coleman, 38, with warm brown eyes and a ponytail of chestnut hair peeking out from under a worn trucker's cap. She wore a flannel shirt tucked into jeans, her boots scuffed but sturdy. Her smile was immediate, bright enough to cut through the morning's gloom, and it caught James off guard. "You, Jake?" she asked, her voice carrying a faint southern lilt. He nodded, managing a "yeah, that's me," his throat dry. "Well, come on, partner," she said, tossing him a playful grin. "We got a long road ahead." They walked to the rig, Sarah's stride confident, her chatter easy. She climbed into the passenger seat as James took the wheel, the cab feeling smaller with her presence. As they pulled onto the highway, the rain began, a light drizzle that smeared the windshield. Sarah fiddled with the radio, settling on a country station, the twang of a guitar filling the space. "Hope you don't mind a little Dolly Parton," she said, leaning back. "Keeps me sane on these runs." James smiled, surprised at how quickly her warmth disarmed him. In his old life, conversations were strategic. Every word weighed for impact. Here, with Sarah, it was different, light, human, real. Their talk started small, the kind of banter that stitches together strangers. Sarah shared tips about the route. Avoid the left lane near Columbus. Watch for deer on the back roads. Hit the diner in Chillicothe for the best pie. She laughed about a time she'd spilled coffee all over her logbook during a sudden stop, her eyes crinkling with mischief. James, as Jake, offered a few cautious stories, careful to keep his cover. He mentioned a fictional past odd jobs, a stint as a mechanic piecing together a life that sounded plausible. Sarah listened, nodding, her gaze sharp but kind, as if she could sense the gaps in his story, but chose not to pry Dodd as the miles rolled by. The rain thickened, the wipers slapping a steady rhythm. Sarah's chatter turned to the job itself. "Been driving for Whitaker 10 years, she said, her tone shifting, a hint of weariness creeping in. "It's tough, but it pays the bills." "You new to this?" James nodded, seizing the chance. "To learn. What's it like, doing this long term?" he asked, his curiosity genuine. Sarah sighed, staring out at the wet highway. "It's a living. You get used to the hours, the sore back, the bad coffee. But the road, it takes things from you. Time with family, mostly." Her voice softened, and James felt a pang. He'd never considered what his drivers left behind to keep his company running. The conversation paused as they navigated a congested stretch near Cincinnati, the traffic slowing to a crawl. Sarah pulled out a small photo from her wallet, holding it up with a smile. "My boy, Ethan," she said. The picture showed a boy, about 10, with her brown eyes and a grin full of braces, clutching a sci-fi novel. "He's my whole world," she added, her voice thick with pride. James glanced at the photo, his chest tightening. He'd seen countless reports on his desk, but never a face like Ethan's, never a story tied to the names. "He looks like a good kid," he said, the words feeling inadequate. Sarah nodded, tucking the photo away. "He's the best. Keeps me going, even when it's hard." The rain eased as they crossed into Kentucky, the landscape shifting to rolling hills and dense forests. Sarah's mood brightened, and she shared lighter stories. Ethan's obsession with space movies, the time she taught him to change a tire in their driveway. But James sensed a weight behind her words, a shadow she wasn't ready to reveal. He wanted to ask more, to understand the woman beside him, but he held back, afraid of crossing a line. As Jake Turner, he was just a coworker, not a CEO with the power to fix things. The realization frustrated him, a reminder of how little control he had in this world. By late afternoon, they stopped at a truck plaza for fuel and a break. The rain had stopped, leaving the air damp and cool. Sarah stretched beside the rig, her flannel shirt catching the fading light. "You're quiet for a new guy," she teased, tossing him a bottle of water. "What's your story, Jake? Got a family waiting somewhere?" James hesitated, the lie forming slowly. "Not really," he said. "Just me and the road for now." Sarah studied him, her smile softening. "Fair enough. The road's good for figuring things out. Just don't let it keep you too long." Her words lingered, a quiet warning that felt more personal than she let on. As they climbed back into the cab, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of gold and purple. Sarah's ease, her resilience, her unguarded warmth, they stirred something in James, a mix of admiration and unease. He'd come to see his drivers' lives, but he hadn't expected to feel so drawn to one of them. And he hadn't expected the guilt, sharp and insistent, that he knew so little about the people who made his empire possible. The highway stretched ahead, leading them toward a night that would change everything. The Tennessee border was a quiet line in the dusk, marked by a faded sign and a shift in the air, cooler now, scented with pine. James drove, the rig's headlights carving a path through the gathering dark. Sarah sat beside him, her earlier chatter replaced by a thoughtful silence. The country music had faded to static, and she switched it off, the hum of the engine filling the cab. Something had shifted since their stop at the truck plaza, as if the road itself had drawn her inward. James felt it to a sense that the small talk was done, that something deeper was waiting to surface. "Ethan's not like other kids," Sarah said suddenly, her voice soft but steady. James glanced at her, her face half lit by the dashboard's glow. "He's smart. Loves those big books about space and aliens. But 2 years ago, he started getting sick. Real sick." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of her cap. "Doctors called it a rare blood disorder. No cure, just treatments to keep him going. Expensive ones." James's grip tightened on the wheel, his heart sinking. He'd overseen budgets with millions in medical expenses, but they were numbers, not lives. Now, Sarah's words gave those numbers a face. She went on, her voice steady but laced with pain. "The bills piled up fast. I was already working doubles, but it wasn't enough. Had to sell our house, move to a 1-bedroom apartment. Ethan sleeps on the couch most nights." She laughed, a brittle sound. "He says it's like camping, but I know he misses his room." James swallowed, his throat tight. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. As Jake, he was powerless. As James, he was complicit. He'd never questioned the company's bare-bones health plan, never considered who it failed. Sarah's story deepened as the miles passed. She spoke of sleepless nights, waiting for test results, of Ethan's courage despite the needles and hospital stays. "He asked me once if he could join the basketball team if he got better," she said, her voice breaking. "I couldn't promise him, Jake. I just couldn't." Her eyes glistened, but she blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. James stared at the road, his own eyes burning. In his world of boardrooms and bonuses, he'd never faced a moment like that, a moment where hope felt like a lie. Sarah's strength, her refusal to break, was unlike anything he'd known. The cab felt smaller now, the air heavy with her words. Sarah leaned back, her voice dropping to a whisper. "There was a night, maybe a year ago, when I thought I couldn't do it anymore. The bills, the worry, the driving, it was too much. I sat in this very cab, parked at a rest stop, and I thought, maybe Ethan would be better off without me." James's breath caught, his hands trembling on the wheel. But then I pictured his face, those big eyes looking at me like I'm his whole world. And I knew I had to keep going. For him. She straightened, her voice firm again. Ethan's my reason, Jake. No matter how hard it gets, I'll never give up on him. James couldn't speak. The weight of her story pressed against him, a mirror reflecting his own privilege. He thought of his penthouse, his vacations in Aspen, the ease of his life. And here was Sarah, fighting a battle he couldn't imagine with a resilience that left him in awe. For the first time, he saw the human cost of his empire, not in spreadsheets, but in the woman beside him, in the boy in her photo. Guilt coiled in his chest, sharp and unfamiliar. He'd spent years chasing profit, but what had he ignored along the way? The moment was shattered by the shrill ring of Sarah's phone. She answered, her face paling as she listened. "What do you mean, worse?" she said, her voice rising. "He was fine yesterday." James glanced over, his pulse quickening. Sarah's hand shook as she gripped the phone. "I'm 6 hours away," she said. "I'll get there as soon as I can." She hung up, her breath ragged. "It's Ethan," she told James, her eyes wide with fear. "He's in the hospital. His fever spiked, and they're running tests. I need to be there." James's mind raced. They were still hours from Knoxville, with a delivery deadline looming. He knew the rules. Drivers couldn't abandon the run without approval, and Carl, the dispatcher, was notorious for saying no. But Sarah's panic was palpable, her hands clutching her cap like a lifeline. "I'll talk to Carl," James said, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. He pulled over at a rest area and dialed the dispatch office, his cover as Jake teetering on the edge. Carl's voice was curt. "No way, Coleman. We're short-staffed. Finish the run, then go." Sarah's face crumpled, and James made a snap decision. "I'll finish the route alone," he told her. "Take my car from Knoxville and get to Ethan. I'll cover for you." Sarah stared at him, disbelief giving way to gratitude. "Jake, you don't even know me," she whispered. He shook his head, unable to explain the urge to help, the need to do something right. "Oh," he said, "Ethan needs you." She nodded, tears spilling over, and grabbed her bag. As she ran toward the rest area's rental lot, James realized the risk he'd taken. Driving solo would push him past legal hours, a violation that could draw scrutiny to his fake credentials. If Carl checked his logs, or if Tom's suspicious glance from the other night meant anything, his cover could unravel. The highway loomed ahead, dark and endless. Sarah's story echoed in James's mind, a call he couldn't ignore. He'd come to see his driver's world, but now he saw their hearts and his own laid bare for the first time. The Tennessee night was a tapestry of stars, scattered across a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the world. James Whitaker, still cloaked in the guise of Jake Turner, drove his rig through the darkness, the hum of the engine a steady pulse beneath his thoughts. Sarah Coleman's story clung to him like the damp air after a storm, her words replaying in his mind. "Ethan's my reason, Jake. No matter how hard it gets, I'll never give up on him." He'd sent her to her son, taking on the rest of their shared route alone, a decision that now felt both reckless and right. The dashboard clock glowed 2:17 a.m., marking the hours he'd pushed past legal driving limits. His eyes burned, his hands ached, but Sarah's face etched with fear. And gratitude kept him going. For the first time in years, James felt the weight of someone else's life, and it was heavier than any deal he'd ever closed. The road to Knoxville was a winding ribbon of asphalt, flanked by dense forests and the occasional flicker of a deer's eyes in the headlights. James's body protested every mile, his back knotted from the sagging seat, his legs stiff in the cramped cab. The solitude, once a nagging discomfort, now felt like a mirror, reflecting the gaps in his understanding. Sarah's story had cracked something open in him, a realization that his drivers weren't just cogs in his machine. They were people, each carrying burdens he'd never seen. A sick child, a missed birthday, a dream deferred. As CEO, he'd measured success in profits and market share. As Jake, he saw the human cost, and it left him reeling. He pulled into a rest area just before dawn, the lot quiet except for the low rumble of idling trucks. The delivery was done, the cargo safely unloaded in Knoxville, but the violation of driving hours gnawed at him. If Carl, the dispatcher, checked his logs, questions would follow questions Jake Turner couldn't answer without risking his cover. James leaned back, closing his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, he saw Ethan's face, the boy from Sarah's photo, his grin full of braces and hope. Then he saw Mike griping about late payments at the truck stop. Anna sending money to her mother. Tom, whose quiet stare had lingered too long. How many others were out there, driving through the night, their stories untold? The question settled like a stone in his chest, heavy with guilt. He'd built an empire, but on whose backs? The next morning, James reported to a new hub in Nashville, assigned a solo run to St. Louis. The fatigue was bone deep now, his hands blistered from wrestling the wheel, his mind foggy from sleepless nights. The rig's clutch was sticky, the brakes sluggish, a reminder of the aging fleet he'd approved budgets for without a second thought. As he loaded his cargo boxes of auto parts stacked high on pallets, he overheard a group of drivers. Near the loading dock, their voices low and tense. "They're cutting benefits for sure," one said, a wiry man with a sunburned neck. "Heard Hayes is pushing Whitaker to sign off. More money for the suits, less for us." James's stomach twisted. Richard Hayes's name was a thorn, pricking at his conscience. He wanted to step in, to promise it wouldn't happen, but Jake Turner was powerless, a nobody with a fake ID and a borrowed life. The drive to St. Louis was a gauntlet of challenges. A sudden storm swept in, rain hammering the windshield so hard the wipers could barely keep up. James navigated blindly, his heart pounding as the rig fishtailed on a slick curve. Then, just outside Louisville, a tire blew with a deafening bang, the truck lurching violently. He wrestled it to the shoulder, his pulse racing, and climbed out into the downpour. The rain soaked his jacket as he knelt in the mud, struggling, with a jack and a spare tire heavier than he'd expected. His hands slipped, the tools clumsy in the cold, and for a moment he felt utterly defeated. This was the reality his drivers faced: breakdowns, delays, danger, while he'd sat in his office, signing off on maintenance cuts to boost the bottom line. The irony was bitter, and it fueled him to finish the job. His fingers raw but determined. Back in the cab, soaked and shivering, James pressed on. The storm cleared, revealing a sunset that painted the sky in shades of fire. He stopped at a diner outside St. Louis, its fluorescent lights a harsh contrast to the fading day. The other drivers at the counter were a familiar mix, weary, weathered, bound by the shared language of the road. James joined them, his cover as Jake now second nature, though every conversation tested his resolve. Mike was there, his usual gruff humor tempered by worry. "Heard some drivers talking strike," he said, stirring his coffee. "If they cut our insurance, what choice we got?" James nodded, his jaw tight. A strike would cripple Whitaker Logistics, a crisis he'd have to face as CEO. But as Jake, he could only listen, the powerlessness a new kind of torment. Tom, the quiet driver from Dayton, sat at the end of the counter, his eyes flickering toward James. There was something in his gaze, recognition, suspicion, that set James on edge. Had Tom seen him before, maybe at a company event years ago? The thought was paranoid, but it lingered. James excused himself, claiming a need for air, and stepped outside. The night was cool, the lot alive with the hum of trucks. He dialed Emily, his assistant, from a burner phone, his voice low. Check on any benefit cuts, he said. Hayes might be moving without my approval. Emily's pause was heavy. Richard's been asking about you, James. He's curious. Be careful. The warning sent a chill through him. Richard's investigation was closing in, and a single slip could expose everything. The final days of his journey blurred into a haze of highways and deadlines. James drove routes through Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, each mile a lesson in endurance. He saw his drivers differently now, their faces no longer anonymous. There was the older man who taped a photo of his grandkids to the dash, the young woman who sang off-key to pass the time, the veteran who drove with a prosthetic leg and a quiet pride. Each was a thread in the fabric of his company, and James felt the responsibility to weave them together, not tear them apart. Sarah's story had been the spark, but these glimpses of others fanned it into a flame. He couldn't go back to his old life, not unchanged. Yet the challenges mounted. A late delivery in Springfield drew a sharp reprimand from a supervisor who eyed James's paperwork with suspicion. Your logs don't add up, Turner, he said, his tone clipped. James mumbled an excuse about a mix-up, but the scrutiny was unnerving. Then, at a truck stop in Missouri, he overheard another rumor. A group of drivers was planning a protest at the Chicago hub, a direct challenge to Whitaker's leadership. The news hit like a punch. As CEO, he'd have crushed dissent with a press release and a pay bump. As Jake, he saw the desperation behind it, the years of being unheard. The conflict tore at him, loyalty to his company versus a newfound loyalty to its heart. As the second week neared its end, James felt the strain of his double life. His body was bruised, his mind stretched thin. He'd come to see his driver's world, but now he saw its fractures and his role in creating them. The road had taught him more than he'd expected, but it had also raised a question he couldn't yet answer. What would he do when he returned to his tower? The answer lay somewhere ahead, in the choices he'd make and the legacy he'd leave. For now, he drove on, the stars above a silent witness to a man learning to listen. The Chicago skyline glittered against the evening sky, a constellation of steel and glass that marked the end of James Whitaker's 2-week odyssey. No longer Jake Turner, he stood once more in his corner office on the 47th floor of Whitaker. Logistics, his navy suit crisp, but his heart irrevocably changed. A duffel bag of worn jeans and flannel shirts lay discarded in his apartment, but the road's lessons clung to him. Sarah Coleman's voice, Ethan's brave smile, the quiet struggles of drivers like Mike and Anna. He'd gone undercover to see his company's heart, and what he found had reshaped his own. Now, as CEO, he faced a choice: return to the man he'd been, or build a legacy that honored the people who'd opened his eyes. The first morning back, James called an emergency meeting with his senior team. The boardroom was a stark contrast to the truck stops he'd known: polished oak table, leather chairs, a view of Lake Michigan, but it felt hollow without the raw humanity of the road. Richard Hayes sat at the far end, his sharp eyes tracking James with barely concealed suspicion. Emily, his assistant, took notes, her glance warm but cautious. James stood, bypassing the usual slides and spreadsheets. I've been gone 2 weeks, he began, his voice steady but charged with something new. I wasn't on vacation. I was on our trucks, driving our routes, living our drivers' lives, and I learned we've been failing them. He told Sarah's story, careful not to name her, his words painting a vivid picture: a mother working endless hours, a son fighting, a rare illness, a family held together by sheer will. The room was silent, the executive shifting uncomfortably. Richard leaned forward, his voice smooth but edged. Inspiring, James, but we're running a business, not a charity. James met his gaze, unflinching. A business is its people, Richard. Without them, we're nothing. He announced sweeping changes: a 15% pay raise for drivers, expanded health benefits, mental health support, and a hardship fund for employees in crisis. The cost would be millions, a hit to profits, but James didn't care. For the first time, he felt he was leading, not just managing. Richard's face darkened, his fingers drumming the table. The board won't approve this. You're risking our stock price. James's response was calm but ironclad. Then I'll resign. But these changes happen, with or without me. The room stilled, the weight of his conviction palpable. Emily's pen paused, her eyes wide. Richard said nothing, but his silence was a retreat. The meeting ended with a directive. Implement the changes immediately. As the team filed out, James caught Emily's nod, a quiet affirmation that he'd chosen the right path. Weeks later, James arranged a private meeting with Sarah Coleman. He'd tracked her down through payroll, learning she was back in Ohio after Ethan's hospital scare. The boy was stable, but the bills were mounting. James invited her to the Chicago headquarters, his heart pounding as he prepared to reveal the truth. When Sarah walked into his office, her flannel shirt and trucker's cap, a stark contrast to the sleek decor, her eyes widened. "Jake," she said, her voice a mix of shock and recognition. James smiled, stepping forward. "It's me, Sarah, but my real name is James Whitaker." He explained everything. His undercover journey, the lessons he'd learned, the changes he was making because of her. Sarah listened, tears glistening in her brown eyes. When he finished, she wiped her face, her voice trembling. "Thank you," she said simply, the words carrying a weight that humbled him. James offered her a new role, logistics coordinator. At the Ohio hub, a desk job with flexible hours so she could be with Ethan. He also revealed the Ethan Coleman Fund, a foundation to support families facing medical crises, seeded with his personal wealth. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her tears falling freely now. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered. James shook his head. "I did. Because of you, I saw what matters." The changes rippled through Whitaker Logistics. Drivers received their raises, benefits improved, and the hardship fund began helping families like Sarah's. The threat of a strike dissolved, replaced by a cautious hope among the workforce. Richard Hayes, sensing the shift, quietly backed off, his investigation into James's absence shelved. The company's stock dipped briefly, but James's bold vision, a company that valued its people, drew praise from industry analysts and loyalty from employees. For James, the numbers were secondary. Standing at his office window, watching the city's lights mirror the highways he'd traveled, he felt a peace he'd never known. His father's words echoed, "A company is its people." He'd finally understood. Asterisk. The story of James Whitaker and Sarah Coleman is more than a tale of a CEO and a driver. It's a reminder that true success isn't measured in wealth or power, but in the lives we touch. James learned that empathy isn't a weakness. It's a strength that builds bridges between boardrooms and backroads. Sarah showed us that resilience and love can shine through the darkest nights. Their story teaches us to listen, to see the unseen, to act with kindness when it matters most. Every truck on the highway carries a story, a struggle, a dream. The next time you pass one, think of Sarah and Ethan and ask yourself, what can I do to make a difference? Stories like these are why we share them on Legacy Stories. They remind us of the power of human connection, the courage to change, and the impact of standing up for what's right. If James and Sarah's journey moved you, inspired you, or made you see the world a little differently, let us know in the comments. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and join our Legacy Stories community by hitting that subscribe button. Together, we can keep these lights shining, one story at a time. Until next time, drive safe and keep listening.